back, my friends, to the D-Rate the Hate podcast. I am your host, Wilk of WilkWorld.com, and I am so incredibly grateful that you have taken the time to join me for another great episode. Here at the D-Rate the Hate podcast, we're all about bettering the world one attitude at a time. You know, we did not create the hate, but with your help, we can derate the hate. It starts with each of us as an individual. So what have you done today to make your life a better life? What have you done today to make the world a better place? Making your life a better life starts with individual accountability. How we act, how we react, no matter what happens to us, how we react to it makes the difference. Friends, one of the great things about a bad attitude is we as individuals have the power to change it. One great way to do that, share the D-Rate the Hate podcast. Share it with your network of friends. Get them to share it. Subscribe. Leave us ratings and feedback. Always greatly appreciated. And with that, let's go. Friends, to say this past couple weeks has been an absolute whirlwind, just so busy, would be an absolute understatement. I just wanted to drop this episode to talk about a new initiative that my friends at Braver Angels are working on, and that is called Braver Politics. I recently sat down for another great conversation with my friends Rick Hotchner and Barbara Thomas, two very involved people in the organization Braver Angels, local ambassadors here in the state of Minnesota. Barbara has now become a co-chair of National Field Operations. Now, you may remember Rick and Barbara from our initial conversation way back in episode 48 when I first became aware of Braver Angels, and that's where our friendship started. Since then, as you know, or the regular listeners of the DTH podcast know, I've become much more involved with Braver Angels, and they have become just great friends of mine. And we recently had a conversation talking about that new initiative, Braver Politics. I just wanted to share that conversation with you. A lot of good content in there, a lot of good just back and forth about what Braver Politics is, how people can get involved, and what it actually does to bridge that political divide, get people to engage versus constantly being enraged. You're not going to want to miss this conversation. A lot of important stuff in there, so much important work that needs to be done in this country, and so many great ways to get involved. Maybe, just maybe, you'll want to get involved too. Check it out.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello. How are you?
Doing well. How about you?
Doing very well. What's going on with you guys?
Keep them busy.
All right, so Braver Politics. Let's learn more about that.
Well, so Braver Politics is an initiative that we started in the last year. I mean, it's been brewing for some time, but really in earnest, trying to take the really proven methods of Braver Angels and bring them into the political sphere. And by that, we mean we're engaging at all levels, from the federal level to state legislatures to municipal governments all around the country, and really trying to have an impact on how politics are conducted and turning the tide on the toxicity of our current system.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of how politicians and staffs communicate with each other, and then also how politicians and staffs communicate with constituents and vice versa.
Yeah, no, I think it's a much needed thing, because we always hear stories, and I think this is one of the reasons that people tune out so much and get fed up and just sick of these types of things, is because we hear, stories of, like a Mitch McConnell and a Chuck Schumer, yeah. They'll say all these toxic things, to rile up the public, and just the most bombastic and hyperbolic garbage when they're on camera. And then an hour later, they're, having dinner together, sitting and having drinks and laughing it up and yucking it up like aristocrats, that we really showed them people, so having the Braver Angels model, and instead of having that garbage press conference kind of, well, let's see how many people we can get riled up today, but actually having those conversations in a Braver Angels model, I think, is incredibly important. And I don't just mean them, because quite honestly, if we don't get back to a point in this country where it's the government that governs closest, governs best, and people are involved at a local level, and then less so at a state level, and far less so at a national level, and get rid of in the national government, the federal government being more of a transparent part of everybody's life, meaning that it's just in the background, it's running, it's there, but it's not part of every single person's everyday life. That's not the way that it was ever intended to be. And it damn sure needs to go away, because if it doesn't, we're all screwed. Then we're just subjects, beholden to a federal government. And that's where we're at now. But I think people do need to get involved. So I like the idea of getting Braver Politics more involved in the state, local, and municipal government bodies, and having those workshops where people are actually involved. You've got the constituents here, you've got the politicians here, having that civil conversation, as opposed to how often do we see nowadays where, especially at these school board meetings, where, our public school system is absolute garbage right now. It is a absolute dumpster fire. And every single time we see, and it's obviously it's not every single time that there's a school board meeting, but all we see is those that turn into a nightmare, right? Same thing I talk about all the time on the podcast. That's the stuff that gets the coverage. So 24-hour news cycle, they're looking for stuff like that. That's all we see on the news. So then all of a sudden, every school board meeting is that, but it's not. So what we need to do is we need to highlight those that are actually going well, something their solutions are actually found, and not just the ones where the parent is going off on the school board and the school board says, well, we're going to raise your child. You're not. You don't get a say in what's happening in our school.
I think there's a couple of things going on. And one, you're right that the stuff that's going to get the attention, the stuff that's going to get the airplay is the screaming at each other, right? It's not deemed newsworthy if there's a efficiently well-run school board meeting that decides stuff and people go home to their kids. Like, that's not going to hit the news, right? Mm-hmm. So it leaves people with the impression that everyone across the country is always and forever screaming in each other's faces, which is a distortion. But that distortion, I think, keeps us from feeling like there's anything we can do about it, right? It gives this sense of helplessness and hopelessness for a lot of people, because they feel like, well, it's just chaos and it's a mess everywhere. And when you never hear about things working right, and you are just constantly bombarded with messages that we're all going to hell in a handbasket, then you throw up your hands and you just tune it out. And it keeps people from taking steps to make it better. But there's also actually real problems that are coming out really at the local level. And sometimes I think that's because those are the leaders that people can find in real life, face to face, right?
That's the way that it's supposed to be.
Right. Yeah. But if you're mad about stuff going on in the country and you go scream at your city council member, there's people who talk about working in municipal jobs and having people in their face about immigration. Now, that's not actually what we do. Like, right. We're trying to fix the potholes and keep the park in shape, right?
Right.
The National League of Cities did a study, I think last year, and they found that over 80% of municipal officials have been subject to harassment, threats, or actual violence.
Wow.
80%. I mean, this is it's out of control. Like, bringing the hostility wherever it's coming from, into just the local level politics is just out of control. And that's part of why there's a real hunger for the braver politics kinds of programming, where you can relearn how to be engaged citizens instead of being continually enraged citizens.
Right. Engaged versus enraged. I like that a lot.
Yep.
So now, and this, I will take this right back to something that I talk about quite often in ignorance causing hate and anger. What you just said there, I hadn't even thought about before, but I think it's very important. Is people, and it kind of goes to a point that I made earlier, people don't really understand anymore, and this is a testament to how piss poor our education system has become, but they don't understand how government works anymore. Because to go to the city clerk at the office where you're paying your property taxes and start hollering in their face because of immigration, I think people maybe in their mind look at government as let's say a business. Okay, so I worked for, prior to coming to the company that I'm with now, I worked for a huge corporation, right? So I, as a district manager, reported to a general manager, and that general manager reported to a regional manager, and that regional manager reports to some regional VP, and then there's the chief operating officer, and then there's a CEO. That's that chain of command. So when one of my employees is mad at the way the company's operating, he's going to come to me, expects me to go to my boss to go to his boss, and blah, blah, blah. I don't think they understand that is not the way that government works. Your state, local, and municipal service people, whether it be whoever, it's not like you report it to them. They're going to report it to their city council member. Their city council member is going to go to their boss, who's, the state representative. And then the state representative is going to take it to the congressional person. That's not the chain of command in our government, but they don't know that. And it never even dawned on me until you said that, because they don't even know how that stuff works. They don't know anymore. Half the people don't even understand the three branches of government when it comes to our federal government, let alone who their state representative is and what their state representative's job is. Our state representatives have absolutely nothing to do with our U.S. congressman or the senator from our state or whatever. It's two entirely different entities.
Right.
They do different things. They don't like report to each other. They may attend an event together, and they may campaign together, and they may do this, but it's not like one of them is in the same chain of command as the other. And certainly your county clerk and your city council member and stuff like that, it's not, they're different. They're completely different entities. It's like going and bitching at the manager at McDonald's because your steak was undercooked at Texas Roadhouse. Just because they both serve beef doesn't mean that they're in part of the same command,
Fair point.
I think maybe it's that ignorance of how government works is maybe the other side of the coin from part of what our polarization is causing. So you mentioned before that, talking about about working people who don't feel heard and understood, and so they basically just opt out. That's almost the best case scenario. The other scenario is that people start looking for ways outside of the normal system and outside the normal discourse to get relief for what they want. That's even worse if they don't understand how the system works. But it's also not a good thing when there are a lot of people on the extremes who are looking for people like that, who are unhappy with the way things are, don't feel heard, don't feel respected, have concerns that they feel aren't being addressed. And then they have people who are calling to them on the sides, on the extremes, saying, we're worried about these things too, come with us. And so I think that's actually a worse problem. I mean, apathy is bad enough, and lack of trust in our elected officials and government and so on, that's bad enough. But when that ends up, when people respond to that by trying to go outside the system in sometimes some extreme ways of their own, that's where we really get off track. And of course, like you and Barbara were talking about before, if it bleeds, it leads. So in a country of 330 million people, you're always going to find somebody doing something like that then the media can use as an example of how, the whole country's going to hell in a handbasket. And I think, it's one thing Barbara and I talk about when we're doing presentations and stuff is, if you look at polls and different studies and things like that, it's probably 10 to 20% of our country that are sort of, I'll say, not reachable. And the way I'll define that is not about sort of the policies that they believe in or advocate. It's about what they think of people who disagree with them. The other side is evil. The other side is trying to destroy the country, those people. And so 10 to 20% of the people are like that. Those are the people, like you say, the people who are the most ignorant, are the ones who are the loudest. They're sucking up all the oxygen. They're the ones trying to divide us. They're the loudest. Meanwhile, there's the 80 to 90% of the people who, for one reason or another, and I think there's a range of reasons, who are letting them do it to us. We're being marginalized by 10 to 20% of the population because we don't believe we can make a difference. We think we're too divided. We're scared because sometimes when people stick their head up above the parapet, they're getting smacked. And whether you want to use the term cancel culture or not, that's happening. People have suffered material consequences for speaking out in ways that those 10 to 20% don't believe in. And so a lot of people, I think, in that 80 to 90% who are open to other perspectives, open to talking to people with whom they disagree. They're just keeping their heads down. Not enough people are engaging. And so everything that Braver Angels is trying to do, everything that Braver Politics could do, if it's successful, is giving those people a venue, a vehicle to be able to engage with others from that 80 to 90%, so that we can, I don't know that the goal is to marginalize that 10 to 20%. The goal, though, is to have their influence on our political discourse be more commensurate with their numbers, rather than what they're doing now, which is, like I said, they're marginalizing the grand majority of people.
Right. I mean, you figure, okay, so the United States, one of the biggest problems that we have is the fact that we have some of the lowest voter turnouts of any, first world country, right? I mean, people just don't get involved. And I think a lot of the reason that they don't is because of that 10 to 20% that you're talking about, Rick. They don't want to hitch their wagon to anything that could be construed as offensive or like you talked about, real material damages. There have been people whose businesses and livelihoods have been destroyed because they made a comment on a controversial topic, and that 10 to 20% just literally went in on them like a pack of tent worms on an apple tree, just wiped them out. They're just this little coordinated set of bugs that just come in and destroy everything that they get a hold of. So people are like, you know what? I'm just going to back up. I don't want to be involved. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not even going to vote because my voice doesn't matter anyway. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to be involved and whatever. But yeah, that I think that's so important that we need to get back to a point where that 10 to 20% that is so vocal and so toxic needs to be more commensurate with their numbers, I think is the way that you put it. And I like that.
One of the things that Braver Politics has done, because there's a lot of different, we've modified standard workshops that we use in the general population to specifically address elected officials or their staffs and things like that. But one of the really interesting things to come out of the Braver Politics developments, in my view, is the thing that we're doing with constituent conversations. because it's like the model, even elected officials are frustrated because they're trying to communicate with their constituents. But if they hold a public forum, very often it turns into a shouting match. People get up at the microphone and are yelling their talking points, and everybody's all worked up and angry. And it's very hard to just have a conversation, even for the elected official, to have a conversation with their own constituents, to find out what they care about, what their values are, what their concerns are, and so on. And so we've been working on developing this model, which we piloted here in Minnesota. And I had the good fortune to witness one of them. And it was with Representative Dean Phillips. And he picked a community in his constituency and worked with the staff. And there's a process for it, but they identify people who live in that community, and they get a mix of, do you identify as leaning conservative or leaning liberal or progressive? So they get a mix of people, and through polling, sort of the people pick the topic. And so they get together and they're led through a conversation with their elected official at the table as one of them, right? It's not the elected official standing off to the side talking at or being talked at by their constituents, but they're at the table with them and going around and sharing, sort of values and what shaped their views on this issue and what they're concerned about and so on. And in that Braver Angels way, it's structured to be a constructive conversation instead of spiraling downward. Mm-hmm. And this is something that has a lot of interest from elected officials themselves as just being a better vehicle for communicating constructively.
Well, it's certainly much more productive than what we're getting now, because again, going back to what we said earlier, if it just spirals into a shouting match,
right,
and more animosity is built amongst those who feel X and those who feel Y,
right,
and now it's just degraded into a shouting match, and nothing's really getting done, except those who feel Y are more pissed at those
right,
who feel X, and vice versa.
Yes.
Yeah. That question, how and how did you come to feel the way that you feel? How did you come to your position on this particular topic versus just shouting about the topic?
Right.
That's the really important part of that model, because at least then you can get a feel for that person, who they are, how they got to the way that they are. I may not agree with you at the end of that conversation. I still may not agree with where you're at on that topic, but at least I know how you got there.
Right.
And maybe I can better understand the humanity behind that decision. I think that's important. And trying to scale that model, that's a big part of one of the things that I want to help do when it comes to Braver Angels and Braver Politics, is figure out a way that we can scale this. And I really think that model needs to be brought to every municipality, every local government, every municipality in this country that we can get to listen. Because I can tell you this, if you can get the people at the local level to see the merits in that system, that project or whatever, and they can see that it's gaining traction and that their constituents are resonating to it, it will work upward.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because the stuff that's happening at the upper level, like I said, our federal government needs to go back to being just a transparent entity in the background of everybody's life. And we need to live by the workings of our local government and working with those that lead our own community standards and live within our own communities. Again, I think if the upper structure starts to see the value in what's being done at these local levels, if we can scale that and scale it to the whole nation,
Right.
then maybe we can get back to that type of government. And that's what it needs to be. I mean, if we're going to continue on with this great experiment, that really has to be what it's going to be.
I think another idea behind braver politics is that if we are successful like that at the local level, then it's actually those current local politicians that to a great extent will become state level politicians and then national level politicians. And so if they are engaging in these Braver Angels kinds of practices now and then bring them with them on their path to national office, then that's another way to scale it to that level. And I think you're right, what you were saying before in terms of, it's so important that people have these conversations, even if it doesn't change their mind, because the increased understanding itself has a benefit in terms of, I think of, since we talked last, I've done 5 Braver Angels one-on-one conversations. And I think in those, there's been a couple of times where somebody's really given me some food for thought that's made me reconsider things. But for the most part, they haven't changed my position on anything. What they have done is they've expanded my understanding of the issue with both new information, new perspectives, and like you were saying, a la Monica Guzman, an understanding of how people got to that point. And it reminds me of an article that I sometimes talk about. Jonathan Haidt wrote, and of course he's on our advisory board, about a sermon from the rabbi at the temple where he goes, who was talking about sort of the famous Jewish joke about when you bring together 2 Jews, you get 3 opinions. And she was saying, yeah, it's funny, but on the other, there's also another meaning to it, which is when you in the Jewish culture, you have this idea of arguing for the sake of heaven, arguing to find truth. And if you're approaching argument that way, if you're trying to understand the other side, you might be passionate, but you're also engaging respectfully. Then out of the 2 opinions that went into that argument, you actually come out with a third. And that's the broader understanding you have of the topic. And I really think that's what Braver Angels, just if you look at it in its most basic form, the one-on-one conversation, that's what Braver Angels conversations do. If we could expand those to local communities, to constituent conversations with elected officials, candidates, staffers, and then amongst them, that's really the goal. And with it being a nationwide movement, we have people in all 50 states that can work to these ends. Maybe this is something we can do.
Well, that analogy means a lot to me because there's a couple reasons. When you talk about that, and it's a great parable or whatever they would call it, 2 opinions, going in with 2 opinions, coming out with 3, it makes me think of the word synergy from Stephen Covey, and he talks about the solution being a sum greater than its parts. And then it also, I just talked to Michael Ashford recently, and I can't remember who he said came up with the term, but it was called co-creation. And and the thing about that whether you want to call it co-creation or you want to call it synergy or whatever, if you're ever going to come up with a new something that's greater than the sum of its parts, you have to have people listening to one another, because otherwise, literally the whole term compromise is, if I'm going to go in to a conversation with you and now we're going to compromise, so that means I have to give up something I want, you have to give up something that you want, so the sum of that equation is less than what we both wanted. But if we go in with the mindset of synergy or co-creation, and we take the humanity of you and the humanity of me, and I'm truly going to listen to you and you're truly going to listen to me, maybe we can co-create or synergize to find a better solution that sum is greater than its parts. And that is not happening in our government today. So by trying to focus on that model and really listening to understand versus listening to respond, just like Stephen Covey talks about, and using that as a structure, a model, and that's why those Braver Angels one-on-ones that you're talking about, Rick, are so incredibly important, because they really do focus on that. I am listening to understand where you're coming from. I am not listening. And I think the biggest thing that most people are afraid of is, and this is something that I've talked about before on the podcast, people are afraid that it's not that they're afraid that somebody's going to try to change their mind so much all the time. I think they're actually afraid that their mind might change. And then that to them feels like I lost.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to lie, I'm guilty of this too. I think we all are.
Yeah.
But if I go into a conversation and I'm truly listening to somebody, and then all of a sudden I'm like, well, damn, I've got a whole different perspective now, that I'm rethinking everything that I've thought before. But that's almost like a blow to my ego, right? It's almost like I'm thinking, I've been wrong this whole time. And one of the hardest things as human beings that we do is to admit we're wrong, So, those one-on-one conversations, they are important because, I may not come out with a different perspective, just like you said, Rick, but I may come away with more information than I had. And maybe maybe my mind changes, maybe my mind doesn't.
Couple of things. One is, I think it's in that effort to understand and find synergy that we find common ground that we can then work off of. And I think one of the effects, we were talking before about how those who are trying to divide us try to convince us that we're too divided for us to do anything about it. And I think one of the reasons that these conversations are so powerful is because people go in with relatively low expectations about finding common ground, and then they find a lot of common ground, much more than they thought they could. So I think that's an important point. I also think an irony is that I have found, and I think you're right, human beings don't want to be wrong. We don't want to admit we're wrong. It's a blow to our egos, which is why I think it's so important that we try to enter these conversations with an understanding that none of us is omniscient, not be too certain, have a spirit of inquiry, be humble. That makes it more likely that at least we'll be open-minded, but that we will, it's more, I've found, like you were saying before, like if you're confronting somebody head on with your ideas, trying to persuade them, and they feel strongly about their own ideas, there's pretty close to zero chance you're ever going to change their mind. The irony is, I found that if you're not trying to change their mind, you have a better chance of doing it. If instead what you're trying to do is just have a conversation where you're trying to enhance mutual understanding and find common ground, and you're giving somebody the benefit of the doubt that they're well-intended, then there's the opportunity to have a conversation where both sides are open to new information, new perspectives that might cause them to rethink, their own views. And, that's another reason why I've really enjoyed the conversations in Braver Angels, because, and I will say also the conversations that I've had because of Braver Angels in my personal life, where I've taken that mindset of, I'm not going to try to win this discussion. Instead, I'm just going to try to understand the other person and see if I can also be heard, where I feel like those are much more fruitful discussions as a result, and much better, not to mention for the relationships in question, that we can have that kind of discussion rather than the kinds that we were having before that always ended in rows and acrimoniously. Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on the one-on-one point with that, but did you have something?
No, that's all right. I mean, I guess what I was thinking of before was when you were talking about that feeling of struggle, like the changing your mind has all this baggage attached to it. What I was thinking about was how in our world today, our political identities have become central to our identities in a way that didn't used to be true decades ago.
Oh my God, yeah. Yep.
Everything has become politicized. Like where and what you eat is politicized, where you shop, what music you listen to, like all aspects of our life have overtones of political identity now. So if you change your mind about something, sometimes it can feel more than just that issue. Like it has some implication for your whole identity,
and how you fit into your own in group.
Right. How you fit in with your group, your people.
And even to take that one step further, just what you're saying, fitting in with your group, this actually came up in one of our last We the People's conversations. Is I am, and this is where I have such a problem with the Reds label and the Blues label and everything else. I mean, I'm very much an issues voter. Now, if the politician that I like, and this is one of the things that I can't stand about the Trump-Republican kind of mentality nowadays, is if you're not on board with me 100%, then you are somehow against me. And that's just not going to work. It's not, because the perfect can't be the enemy of the good. And now, to Barbara's point, with everything having political overtones or undertones or whatever to it, if I'm not 100% in lockstep with the politician that you like or you say I need to be following, or the politician that so-and-so just endorsed or whatever, and I'm like, well, I'm probably on board like 70% of what he or she just said, and that's cool. But this other person, there's like 30% that they, the 30% of the issues and the way that they're doing things that I'm kind of digging, and that's good. But now that I said something good about Z candidate that so and so didn't endorse, now all of a sudden people are looking at me like, can we really trust him?
Right.
What's this guy? And I'm like, that type of politics cannot last. Because it literally is as toxic to a representative government system as anything else could possibly be. And with everything in our everyday lives now having those political undertones, it's not just anymore who we're going to vote for. It's also what relative we're hanging out with, who's coming over for dinner, who am I going to have drinks on the porch with, who am I going to let my kids play with because their parents may, so that kind of dynamic brought into the fold of everybody's life now,
yes,
is bad. It's toxic. It can't last.
Right.
So,
right.
Very important stuff.
And that's why this work. I mean, that's, the getting involved in Braver Angels. I mean, we both did it because we believe in the cause. Passionately believe in the cause, and we feel like this is pretty close to our biggest problem. And I feel funny saying that, like after the shootings we've been dealing with and everything else, that there are other huge problems out there. But if we can't even talk to each other, we can't solve any of our other problems. So like fixing this gets us to a place where we can have a hope of tackling all the other things that we need to tackle as a country. So getting involved, because I believe in the mission, but being involved has been such an antidote to that sense of despair about the state that the country is in. Just being in touch with people like you and others all around the country who are saying no to all that craziness, saying that is not the world we want to live in. And that's not the world we want our children to grow up in. And we are going to roll up our sleeves and be part of that solution.
Right.
That's so it's inspiring to be part of that network of people all across the country who are trying to mend our social fabric.
Right. Well, and it is important. I don't think the great thing about an organization like this Braver Angels, and I'm really excited about the concept of Braver Politics and how that's going to, manifest bigger and better things. People getting involved. We talked about, red recruitment or earlier. Getting people involved, I think you're right. It is inspiring, and being able to be involved in an organization like Braver Angels and just giving what time you can. I mean, it's not certainly it doesn't require taking on a full-time gig like you guys have in many ways, but just being able to find like-minded people of different mindsets, if that makes any sense. Just because we don't agree doesn't mean we can't agree to have the conversation and have it, civilly and amicably. And I think a lot of people, I think there is a big hunger for that now. And I think the more that we can scale that, the more that we can replicate what's happening, whether it be what's happening here in Minnesota, and taking it to different other local markets and just showing people that it's just like, I always go back to the analogy, hundreds of thousands of airplanes land every single day, but that one that crashes is the one that's going to get all the news coverage, wall to wall, 24-hour news cycle, bleeds it leads. That's why people are afraid to fly. That's why people have such anxiety about getting on airplanes, and they're holding, when the plane's about to land, they're holding their loved ones or their stranger next to them. They're gripping onto their arm. It's because that one time they saw that on the news, they're like, I don't know if I can handle it. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can get on this airplane. It's because that's what gets the airplay. Same way in politics. They see the garbage that a Chuck Schumer spews on podium or at the podium there, or watch the garbage from the White House press briefing room that we see or whatever. And they're like, why would I even want to be involved with that? Or they see the same parent screaming at the school board, and the school board stands up, the school board members stand up and walk out, and the local sheriff's deputy has to tackle the parent and everything else. And they're like, why would I get involved with that? Why would I want to be involved with that? I think there is a strong hunger for being involved in something like this, and finding people that really do want to get along. You and I have said it before, Barbara, we would disagree on just about every political issue, but we can have conversations all day long. We could have conversations constantly. The fact that you two are married and you guys don't agree on political issues, but you're able to have a loving and successful relationship. Even take that to a different level. Look at what James Carville and Mary whatever. What's her name? She's a star. Mary Madeline. Yeah. Madeline. He was a Clinton advisor and one of the most brutal, Democrat operatives in the last, 60 years. And here she's a Republican pundit. But, I heard a conversation with them or an interview with them one time, and they're like, how do you even, they've raised children. They've been married for 30 or 40 years now, and they how do you do it? And I'm like, well, we know what we can talk about. We know what we can't talk about, and we don't let the two worlds collide, but they're able to have a loving relationship and do that. And I think people have lost sight of that. They don't realize, because of those political undertones that have invaded every aspect of our life, they don't realize that there is life outside of what's being broadcast or what you're being inundated with on your news feed on Facebook. And I hope social media is a flash in the pan. I hope it loses its stronghold in people's everyday life and kind of fades off into the distance.
At the very least, it would be good if it was reformed. Jonathan Haidt, whom I mentioned before, recently wrote an article in the Atlantic talking about social media and the adverse effects it's had on our politics and so on. And he has a number of recommendations for sort of how to reform it so we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So like even you acknowledge, social media has some positive benefits, but it needs to be different so that we can account for the significant downsides and the adverse impact that it's had on our politics, on our society, on our discourse, et cetera.
Yeah, no, without a doubt.
You've talked a couple of times, Wilk, about scaling and, how to, getting more people involved in the effort and the Braver politics and Braver Angels in general and Braver politics in particular. And you've also said there's a real hunger for what we're doing out there. And I just want to make the point that I agree with you on both of those. But there's not just a hunger for this in the general population. There's also a real hunger for it in a lot of elected officials. Because, there are people who are, fueling the fires and part of the problem, but they're vastly outnumbered by people who are trying to be public servants. Right? They're trying to represent their community. They're trying to serve their community. And they get into local politics or state level politics, even national politics, because they're trying to be a force for good, however they see that and however they define it. Right? And then they get into it and they find they're just whiplashed by all this, crazy toxicity and so on. And so what we're finding as we do this outreach is that very often it's the elected officials and their staffs who are saying, what do you got? Like, how can we make this better? And so, one of the things we've been developing is a training for people who answers the phones for elected officials, because they answer the phone and they get screamed at.
Oh, I imagine.
Again, it's the yelling about immigration to your municipal official, but even at the national level, that they're trying to, hear out their constituents and they're just getting blasted. And so just trying to help them cope with that situation and learn some skills for managing that in a professional and civil and productive way. When people hear that we can help with that, they're like, sign us up. Mm-hmm. So it's, there's interest in where this is headed. And in a lot of cases, it's pushing on an open door, which is heartening.
Yeah. Well, and I find myself guilty of this probably as much as anything. Is I lump most politicians into one bucket as being politicians, and the people that you're talking about, I think I constantly go back to the Jimmy Stewart movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, right? Goes with the perfect of intentions and whatever, and ends up running around having to punch everybody in the face, but the thing is I do think so many of them do get into politics for the right reasons. They want to be a public servant. They want to be whatever. I think an awful lot of them, and the ones that I end up getting a chance at the microphone all the time, they become more interested in the celebrity status that it's brought to them. And in order to maintain that, in order to feed the beast, they have to be the most hyperbolic. They have to be, if I'm going to get the most airplay, I have to say the most bombastic and venomous things I can, because those are the people that are going to keep me in my celebrity status. And it's just like, you look at even a guy like me, if you look at my numbers online and the number of people who actually, claim to follow me or whatever, not nearly as much as those people that are out there spreading venom and saying the nasty and hyperbolic things. It's just because, like I said before, that hate sells soap. It does. And that venom keeps them, that they spew, that keeps them in front of the camera. It keeps them in front of the microphone. And they really dig that celebrity status. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is, because of that, just like the plane crash analogy, because of that, if that's all everybody sees all the time, now that's the model that everybody has built in their mind for what a politician is. And the same way with the school board meeting. that's the model that everybody, that's what they see on the news. So that's what they think every school board meeting is like. So we have got a very, very long road to hoe here in getting things back and getting things, back on track with our political system. But I don't think it's impossible.
No, absolutely not. maybe the next Braver Angels initiative should be Braver Media.
Yeah. Right.
And the other thing that's really making strides right now, aside from Braver Politics, is the work they're doing in the debates, and a lot of the college debates around the country. That program is growing by leaps and bounds, and getting back to civil exchange of sparring with different ideas that are different from your own in a constructive way, rather than the shutting down of anybody who disagrees with you kind of dynamic that has been getting so pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
So that's encouraging, and they're finding there's a real hunger for that as well. And people who have been feeling like they have to keep their mouth shut while they're studying, because if they speak out about their own views, they're going to get shouted down. It's giving an avenue for people to learn what it means to speak solidly about your own values. And if you're conservative and you're surrounded by a bunch of progressives, to be able to manage that kind of a situation and be true to your values in that, and
mm-hmm.
keep it on a civil plane. So that's exciting work too that they're working on.
Yeah, all this stuff is very exciting. It's very exciting, very important. We can't let ourselves get discouraged, and like I said, it's going to be a long road to hoe. There's no question about it. It's just the same way, in my conversations with Francis Collins and being able to try and figure out a way to rebuild trust between the public health officials and the average everyday American like myself, after what in my opinion has been the biggest boondoggle that the government has ever perpetrated upon the American people. It's going to be a tough road to hoe, but as long as there's people willing to sit down and talk and provide that better model for others to see, the biggest challenge then becomes, how do we get it in front of all those people that are willing to engage? And that's what we need to figure out, because there's, like you said, the hunger is there. There's people willing to do it. And if other people see that, and that becomes the model versus the plane crash or the crazy parent that has to be tackled by the sheriff at the city council meeting or whatever, if the civil model becomes the most prevalent thing that people see, as opposed to as opposed to the alternative, we start to gain traction and things get a lot better.
And we get to start demanding a different kind of politics.
Correct.
From, if we're engaging and expecting that kind of civil exchange, and somebody starts demonizing their opponent, and you can say, like, I don't want to hear that. I want to hear your ideas for solving these problems.
Right.
And, when we reach critical mass and enough of us start demanding that kind of politics, then the incentives shift for the people that are in the game.
Well, it's just like in regular business. You get more of the worst behavior that you'll tolerate, right? I mean, well, I don't care if it's business. I don't care if it's parenting. I don't care if it's, friends or family members that you have poor boundaries with. You get more of the worst behavior that you're willing to tolerate. And for too long in this country, we have tolerated some very, very bad behavior, whether it be with the media or the politicians or whatever. We've tolerated some very, very poor behavior. And it's time we show people that there's a better way. There's a better model. There's a better way to get things done, working to find solutions better than the sums of its parts. Yeah, you definitely do not get that out of Washington now. There's not a single bill that goes through Washington right now that comes out better than the sum of its parts. Not one. It probably hasn't happened in our lifetime. So, braver politics. There's a lot of good stuff going on.
I think so. And we need more people to get involved.
Mm-hmm.
We need more people to sign up, and it's right there at the top of the website now, to learn more and get involved. So there's lots of ways, big and small, that people can roll up their sleeves and be part of the solution, what we need.
Yeah. I mean, and even starting before Braver Politics, just subscribing or even becoming a member for Braver Angels, it's only $12 a year. There's lots of ways, like Barbara said, lots of ways, big and small, to get involved. But even just becoming a member, going to a workshop and seeing what it's all about, and then bringing those lessons into your personal life with your family and friends and colleagues at work and, fellow parishioners at church, whatever it might be, that in itself is a difference. And it can be something that you do organically in the course of your life. If you have time to do something big or small with Braver Angels, that's even better. And if you have a chance to, sign up and help out with Braver Politics, even better. But it's a win if each one of us in our country just understands that we have a stake in depolarization, that the future of our country depends on it. And if we act in our personal lives accordingly, that's a win.
No doubt.
And after that, anything else is welcome and gravy.
No doubt. No doubt. Well, we will definitely going to make sure that we try to get this out to as many people as possible, because it's important stuff. And yeah, like I said, we just want to get more people involved and, feed that hunger, feed the people that really want to be involved. When people see that model changing, when people see that they can expect better things and not just expect better things, but manifest better things by being involved in better things.
Yes.
It just gets better from there.
Awesome.
Friends, I cannot overstate the importance of what Rick just said there. And actually this whole conversation, everything that was just said. But we all have a stake in the depolarization, the better political discourse when it comes to our political system and the future of our country. It doesn't take a lot to get involved. It does not take a lot of time or money to become engaged. As I said, let's all try to engage versus being enraged all the time. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Rick and Barbara. Reach out to us at Braver Angels. Such important work going on. And it's just a matter of dipping that toe in. Get involved. Make something happen. Friends, I just want to say again how very, very grateful that I am that you took the time to join me for another D-Rate the Hate podcast episode. Please share us with your friends. Share us with your network. If you haven't done so already, subscribe and talk your friends into doing the same. Feedback and ratings, wherever you get your audio, always greatly appreciated. And with that, I will just say, get out there, be kind to one another, be grateful for everything that you've got, and remember, it's up to you to make each and every day the day that you want it to be. Friends, if there was anything in this episode that provided exceptional value to you, I would love to hear about it. Email me, wilk@wilksworld.com, or hit me up on most social media platforms. With that, I am going to back on out of here, and we will catch you next week. Take care.